The address glowed wrong on my phone screen, but I was already 20 minutes late, and my manager would dock my pay if I took any longer. So I pushed through the gleaming lobby doors of the high-rise anyway, pizza bags balanced against my hip, the heat seeping through my thin jacket. The doorman barely glanced at me, used to delivery people invading his polished domain, and I slipped into the elevator before he could question whether I belonged in this building, where the monthly rent probably exceeded my yearly income. Floor 28. The hallway smelled like expensive candles and money, thick carpet muffling my worn sneakers, and I checked the receipt again because something fell off, but I was too exhausted to care. 3 jobs and not enough sleep, blurring everything into survival mode. I knocked on 2804, waited, heard movement inside. The door opened and my breath caught because the man standing there was shirtless, all carved muscle and dark ink swirling across his chest and shoulders, and his eyes were gray like winter storms, cold and assessing, and a face too handsome to be safe. He looked annoyed, eyebrows drawn together, mouth set in a hard line. But then his gaze dropped to my hands as I reached for the pizza bags, and everything changed. The air itself shifted. His entire body went still in a way that reminded me of predators on nature documentaries. That focused intensity right before the strike. And I realized he was staring at my wrist where my sleeve had ridden up, exposing the finger-shaped bruises Marcus left last night. Those gray eyes snapped back to my face, and I wanted to run, but my feet would not move. Who did this to you? His voice was quiet, controlled, but something deadly moved underneath the calm. I pulled my sleeve down fast, too fast, stammering that it was nothing. I bruised easily. I just needed payment for the pizza. He did not move from the doorway, did not blink. Asked again who put those marks on me, and I lied. Said I was clumsy, bumped into things. Please, I needed to go. He studied me for a long moment, and I felt stripped bare under that gaze. Like he could see every secret I buried, every excuse I made, every time I covered bruises with makeup and long sleeves. Then he stepped back, pulled out his wallet, handed me bills without counting. Way too much. Easily triple the order cost. Keep it. His voice was softer now, but no less intense. I tried to give back the extra, but he closed my fingers around the money, his hand warm and solid, and careful not to touch the bruises. And then he took the receipt and wrote something on it before handing it back. My personal number. When you are ready. I shook my head, said I did not need anything. Thank you for the tip, and finally my legs remembered how to work. I turned toward the elevator, skin prickling because I knew without looking that he watched me. Felt the weight of his attention like a physical touch. And when the elevator doors finally closed, I sagged against the wall, heart hammering. Something about him terrified me. Something about him felt like salvation. I should throw away the receipt. I tucked it into my pocket instead. The apartment door stuck like it always did, and I had to shoulder it open, the sound loud enough to wake Marcus if he was sleeping. But I found him awake instead, sprawling on our sagging couch with empty beer bottles lined up on the coffee table like soldiers, his eyes tracking me as I entered, and my stomach dropped because I knew that look, that dangerous glassy focus that meant he had been drinking and thinking, and nothing good ever came from that combination. You took forever. His voice was too calm, the kind of calm that preceded storms. I checked the receipt times and my pulse started hammering because I had taken 47 minutes for a delivery that should have been 20. Too long, way too long. And I scrambled for excuses about traffic and wrong addresses, but he was already standing, swaying slightly, closing the distance between us. Who were you with? Nobody. Just deliveries. My manager sent me across town. I tried to keep my voice level and soothing, the tone I used when he got like this. But he grabbed my arm exactly where the bruises already lived, and white-hot pain exploded up to my shoulder. I gasped, could not stop the sound, and something flickered in his eyes. Satisfaction, maybe. Before he accused me of cheating, said I smelled different, looked different, was lying to him. I tried to pull away, and he shoved me backward into the kitchen counter, the edge catching my hip bone, and I tasted fear metallic and familiar. He loomed over me, demanding to know who I was seeing, what I was doing, why I was destroying us. And I made myself small, made myself apologize for things I did not do, agreed that I should have been faster, promised nothing was wrong, anything to diffuse this. He stared at me for a long moment, and I held my breath. Then he released me with a sound of disgust and stumbled back to the couch, reaching for another beer. I did not wait to see if his mood would shift again, just walked quickly to the bathroom, locked the door with shaking hands, and slid down to sit on the cold tile floor. Through the thin door, I heard him muttering, then the television blaring too loud. I pulled out the receipt, now crumpled from my pocket, and smoothed it carefully. Vincent Torino. The name was written in bold black ink, confident strokes that somehow matched the man who had written them. Below it, numbers. A phone number. When you are ready. The words echoed in my head like a promise or a threat, and my hand shook as I traced the letters with my fingertip. I did not know who Vincent Torino was, but I knew what he had seen in those few moments at his door. The truth I worked so hard to hide. And somehow that felt more dangerous than anything Marcus had ever done to me. Because Vincent had offered help. And accepting help meant admitting I needed it. I folded the receipt carefully and tucked it into the small zipper pocket of my purse where Marcus never looked. The one place that was still mine in our shared life of walking on eggshells and making excuses. Tomorrow I would work another double shift, deliver more pizzas, smile at more customers, pretend everything was fine. But tonight, for the first time in months, I fell asleep thinking about gray eyes and a voice that promised protection instead of pain. Tuesday arrived with the weight of unfinished conversations and a black eye I could not completely hide with makeup. Marcus had apologized over coffee and toast, the same script as always, touching my cheek gently where he had struck me and promising it would never happen again. I nodded and said the right words back, but my mind was elsewhere, caught in the memory of gray eyes and a receipt I kept checking was still hidden in my purse. Work passed in a blur of orders and forced smiles until my manager Denise pulled me aside during the dinner rush, her expression tight with concern and irritation. "Sophia, what happened to your face?" Her voice was quiet but sharp, the tone of someone who had dealt with this before. I gave her the same lies I had been practicing for years. Fell down the stairs. Clumsy me. Walked into a door. She did not believe me. I could see it in her eyes, but she also could not prove anything. Just told me to be more careful and sent me back to work with a warning look that said we both knew exactly what was happening. The receipt felt like it was burning a hole in my purse all day. Vincent Torino. When you are ready. I caught myself staring at my phone during breaks, thumb hovering over the numbers, but never dialing. Because what would I say? What did ready even mean? And what kind of man gave his personal number to a stranger delivering pizza, unless he wanted something I was not prepared to give? Thursday night. Marcus came home drunk and angry about losing hours at the warehouse, and I knew before he even looked at me that it was going to be bad. The kind of bad that left marks in places I could not hide. He accused me of stealing money from his wallet, money I had never touched, and when I tried to explain he hit me so hard I saw stars. I woke up on the kitchen floor 3 hours later, my head pounding and my lips split, tasting blood and making a decision that terrified and liberated me in equal measure. I found my phone and dialed before I could lose my nerve. The phone rang twice before a voice answered, deep and calm, and somehow unsurprised. "Vincent." "Sophia." I managed, my voice barely a whisper. "The woman from Monday night. Pizza delivery." There was a pause, and when he spoke again his voice had changed, become sharper, more focused. "Where are you?" "At home." He hurt me again. I was crying now, could not stop the tears that had been building for days. Another pause, longer this time, and I heard something in the background. Movement, maybe voices. "Are you safe right now? Can you get somewhere safe?" "I do not know. I think he is passed out, but I cannot be sure." "Listen to me very carefully," he said, and his voice carried absolute authority. "I am going to send someone to get you. Pack what you need, only essentials. Be ready in 20 minutes. Do you understand?" "Yes," I whispered. "What is your address?" I gave it to him, my voice shaking, barely believing what I was doing. 20 minutes. Do not leave the room until you hear 3 soft knocks. Do not open the door for anyone else." His voice was gentle but unyielding. "And Sophia, you made the right choice calling me." The line went dead, and I stared at my phone for a moment before the reality of what I had just done hit me. I was really doing this. Really letting a stranger, a dangerous stranger whose last name I did not even know how to pronounce correctly, send someone to my apartment to collect me like I was something broken that needed fixing. I moved on autopilot after that, pulling my battered duffel bag from the closet and stuffing clothes into it without caring what I grabbed. Adding my laptop and the small lockbox with my birth certificate and social security card, the only documents Marcus had not found and destroyed during one of his rages. And I worked in silence with my ear pressed to the door, listening to his snores rattling from the couch, thick and wet with alcohol and sleep. 18 minutes after I sent the address, I heard it. 3 soft knocks against the apartment door, exactly as promised. I crept out of the bedroom with my heart hammering against my ribs, stepping over the creaking floorboard near the hallway that always woke Marcus. And when I looked through the peephole, I saw Vincent standing in the dingy corridor that suddenly looked too small to contain him. And beside him was another man, equally tall, equally dangerous, both of them dressed in dark clothes that seemed to swallow the flickering fluorescent light. I opened the door and Vincent's eyes went straight to my face, tracking over the swelling on my cheek and my split lip, and I watched something terrible happen behind his expression, his features going utterly still, while his gray eyes turned to cold fire, a rage so controlled and absolute, it made the air around him feel heavy. "Where is he?" Vincent asked, his voice quiet in a way that promised destruction. And I pointed toward the living room, where Marcus's snores continued undisturbed. And Vincent turned to the other man and said, "Tony, take Sophia downstairs to the car," and the command was absolute. I hesitated, my feet refusing to move, because some part of me needed to know what would happen, needed to witness the moment my old life ended. But Vincent looked at me with those burning eyes and said, "I promise you, Sophia, he will not follow you." And then softer ever, and the certainty in his voice should have terrified me. This confirmation that he would do something irreversible and possibly unforgivable to Marcus. But instead, I felt a wave of relief so powerful, my knees almost buckled because someone was finally going to make it stop. Tony turned out to be a man of few words, which I appreciated because I had none left in me, and he guided me down the narrow apartment stairs with a hand hovering near my elbow, never quite touching, but ready to steady me if I stumbled. And when we emerged onto the street, the black SUV waited like some sleek predator, windows tinted so dark I could not see inside, and he opened the back door and helped me in with surprising gentleness, for someone built like he could break a person in half without effort. The interior smelled like leather and something expensive I could not name, and Tony handed me a bottle of water and a small package of tissues without comment, just a brief nod before he closed the door and took position outside the vehicle. Standing with his back to me, scanning the empty street like threats might materialize from the shadows between the flickering street lights. I sat in the silence and darkness and tried not to imagine what was happening 3 floors above me. Tried not to picture Vincent and Marcus in that cramped living room with its stained carpet and broken blinds. But my mind conjured images anyway, violence playing out in flashes behind my eyes. And I pressed the cold water bottle against my split lip and told myself I did not care what happened to Marcus, that he had made his choices and now faced the consequences. But guilt still twisted in my stomach because some part of me had been trained to feel responsible for male anger, trained to believe I caused the violence I received. I heard it then, voices raised and harsh filtering down through the building's thin walls. Marcus's voice high and panicked, another voice too low and controlled to make out words. And then silence, heavy and absolute. The kind of silence that meant something had shifted, something had ended. My hands started shaking so badly, I nearly dropped the water bottle, and I watched the building in trance with my heart hammering against my ribs, counting seconds that stretched into hours. And then Vincent emerged, just walking out the front door like he had simply paid a social call, his clothes unmarked, his stride unhurried, and even from a distance I could see his face was composed, almost serene, no evidence of whatever had transpired upstairs except for something dark and satisfied in his eyes. When Tony opened the door and Vincent slid into the back seat beside me, the driver, a silent figure I had not even registered before, started the engine without being told. And Vincent looked at me with those gray eyes that saw too much. And he said simply, "Go." And we pulled away from the curb, away from that building that had been my prison. And I finally found my voice and asked, "What did you do?" Needing to know, needing to understand what line he had crossed for me. Vincent was quiet for a moment, his jaw tight, and then he said, "Marcus received a clear message and a financial incentive to leave the city permanently. He will not bother you again. And his voice held such certainty, such absolute finality that I knew whatever had happened in that apartment had been thorough and terrifying, and probably involved threats I could not let myself imagine in detail. I should have felt guilty, should have felt afraid, should have questioned what kind of man solved problems with intimidation and violence. But instead, I felt something else entirely. A lightness spreading through my chest like I had been holding my breath for 2 years and could finally exhale. Liberation so profound it made me dizzy. Vincent asked, "Where do you want to go?" And the question was simple. But the answer was impossible because I had nowhere. No family who would take me in after I had ignored their warnings about Marcus. No friends left after he had systematically isolated me from everyone who cared. No money for a hotel or apartment deposit. Nothing except the clothes in my duffel bag and the bruises on my skin. I admitted I have nowhere, and the words tasted like failure. And Vincent studied me in the dim light filtering through the tinted windows, the city sliding past outside. And he said, "I have a guest house on my property, separate space, fully secure. You can stay there just until you stabilize, figure out your next steps." And I understood what he was really offering. Understood that accepting meant stepping fully into his world, the world of a man who could make other men disappear with a conversation and a financial incentive. But I also understood I was choosing this, choosing him, choosing whatever safety his dangerous protection could provide. The guest house was small and perfect, tucked behind the main estate like a secret. 1 bedroom, a kitchenette, a living area with windows that looked out onto gardens that probably cost more to maintain than I made in a year. Vincent carried my bag inside and set it down carefully, then stood in the doorway like he was afraid to come too close, his hands in his pockets, and his expression unreadable. "The place is yours for as long as you need it," he said. "Mrs. Rosewood, my housekeeper, will bring groceries and anything else you require. And if you need anything at all, you call me directly." And he handed me another card, this one with multiple numbers. Home, office, emergency. I took the card with fingers that only trembled slightly and managed to say thank you, though the words felt inadequate for what he had just given me. Vincent nodded and started to leave, then paused in the doorway. "Sophia." I looked up and met those gray eyes. "You are safe now. Whatever happens next, you are safe." And then he was gone, leaving me alone in a space that was mine, completely mine, for the first time in years. I locked the door behind him and slid down to sit on the polished hardwood floor, finally letting myself cry. Not the silent tears I had learned to shed in bathroom stalls and empty rooms, but huge, ugly sobs that shook my entire body. Grieving for the woman I had been before Marcus, mourning the years I had lost to fear and shame, and celebrating the terrifying freedom of not knowing what came next. The next 3 days passed in a haze of sleep and solitude and slow healing. Mrs. Rosewood appeared each morning with fresh food and clean linens, a kindled woman in her 60s who asked no questions and offered only gentle smiles and the occasional cup of tea shared in comfortable silence. I learned that Vincent owned half the city through businesses that operated in broad daylight and others that definitely did not, that he was dangerous and powerful and had more enemies than friends, but also that he paid for the education of 17 children in the neighborhood and had never missed a payment to the pension fund for the widows of men who had worked for his father. On the 4th morning, Vincent knocked on my door with coffee and pastries from a bakery downtown, and we sat on the small porch overlooking his gardens while he asked about my plans, my hopes, what I wanted to do now that I was free to choose. I admitted I had no idea, that I had spent so long surviving that I had forgotten how to dream, and he listened with the same focused attention he had given me that first night. And when I finished talking, he said he had a proposition. He told me he needed someone to manage the charitable foundation his family ran, someone smart and careful and absolutely trustworthy. The salary was more than I had ever imagined making. The work was legitimate and legal, and I would have complete autonomy to run programs the way I saw fit. It was an offer that should have seemed too good to be true, and maybe it was, but Vincent presented it as simply as ordering coffee, like giving someone a life-changing opportunity was something he did every Tuesday. I said yes because I had nothing left to lose and everything to gain, but also because something in his gray eyes when he looked at me made me want to be the woman he seemed to see when he offered me not just safety, but purpose. The work was challenging and rewarding in ways I had not expected. The Torino Foundation funded literacy programs and job training and healthcare clinics in neighborhoods that had been forgotten by everyone else. And for the first time in years, I felt useful, competent, proud of something I was building instead of ashamed of something I was enduring. Vincent and I worked together closely. Our professional relationship built on mutual respect and a shared vision for what the foundation could accomplish. But there was something else growing between us, a tension that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with the way he looked at me when he thought I was not paying attention, the careful way he never touched me unless absolutely necessary, the gentleness in his voice when he said my name. 2 weeks into my new life, Vincent invited me to dinner at the main house, and I accepted with a flutter of nerves that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with possibility. Mrs. Rosewood found me humming while making coffee in the guest house kitchen, and she gave me a knowing look, her eyes twinkling with barely suppressed amusement as she said, "I had a certain glow about me this morning," and she was happy to see it. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, but could not stop smiling. And she patted my hand in that maternal way she had and said, "Vincent deserved happiness, and perhaps I did, too." I spent the morning helping Mrs. Rosewood with household tasks, needing purpose and activity to channel the restless energy humming through me. And she talked while we worked, sharing stories about Vincent, how she had come to work for him 15 years ago when he was just 19 and newly in charge of the family business, how fierce and brilliant and lonely he had been, how she had watched him build an empire but never let anyone truly close. In the afternoon, I was reading in the guest house when a knock at the door made me tense, instinctive weariness flooding through me because Vincent was gone, and I did not expect anyone. And when I looked through the window, I saw David Sterling standing on the doorstep, looking polite but serious. I opened the door slowly, keeping it partially closed, and he smiled, but it did not reach his eyes as he asked if he could have a few minutes of my time. He was polite, carefully so, but cold in a way that made clear this was not a social visit. And once inside, he got straight to the point, said he needed to understand my intentions with Vincent. I bristled immediately, said that was between Vincent and me, none of his concern. But David shook his head and explained that everything involving Vincent was his concern because his job was keeping Vincent safe, and I was an unknown variable. He warned me that Vincent had enemies, serious, dangerous people who would not hesitate to use me to hurt him, that I was a liability whether I intended to be or not, and his eyes were hard when he said I needed to understand what staying meant. I stood firm despite my racing heart, lifted my chin, and said, "I never asked for any of this, but I was done running from fear, done making myself small to avoid danger, and if staying with Vincent meant risk, then that was my choice to make." David studied me for a long moment, reassessing, and something shifted in his expression before he nodded slowly and said, "Maybe I was stronger than I looked. Maybe I would survive this world after all." He left without another word, but I stood shaking after the door closed, adrenaline flooding through me as I realized I had just been tested and apparently passed. But the encounter left me unsettled and frighteningly aware of how much I still did not understand about the life I was choosing. That evening, dinner was perfect. Vincent had cooked himself, something I had not expected, and the intimacy of sitting across from him in his kitchen while he served pasta and poured wine felt both natural and revolutionary. We talked about everything and nothing, books and music and travel, dreams we had harbored and plans we were making. And underneath it all was a current of attraction so strong I could taste it in the air between us. After dinner, we moved to his study, a room lined with books and warmed by a fire that cast dancing shadows on the walls. Vincent poured brandy and we sat on the leather sofa, not quite touching but close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body. The conversation grew more serious, more personal, and he asked about my childhood, my family, the dreams I had abandoned when survival became my only goal. I found myself telling him things I had never shared with anyone, secrets and fears and hopes that felt too fragile to speak aloud. He listened, actually listened with the full weight of his attention, asked questions about my reasoning, incorporated my thoughts into his planning, and I realized with sudden clarity that I could have purpose here, that I did not have to be just the woman under his protection, but could be a partner in building something. Morning came too quickly, pale light filtering through the curtains, and Vincent kissed my forehead and said he had meetings with his organization leaders, important conversations about territory and alliances that could not be postponed. And then he surprised me by saying he wanted me to come with him, that it was time his inner circle met the woman who had become central to his life. My stomach fluttered with nerves as I dressed in clothes that felt too casual for meeting mob bosses. But Vincent assured me I was perfect, that I did not need to perform or impress anyone, that my presence itself made the statement he needed to make. We drove to a restaurant closed for private business, the kind of establishment that looked modest from outside, but inside was elegant and clearly secured, and in a back room sat 5 men who stood when we entered, their eyes immediately assessing me with the sharp attention of people whose survival depended on reading threats. Vincent introduced them by name and role. David Sterling, whom I had already met, Tony Castellano, who had helped rescue me from Marcus, and 3 others whose names and territories I tried to memorize, and they shook my hand with varying degrees of warmth, but universal weariness. Vincent did not sit, instead stood with his hand on my lower back, and made clear and concise words that I was not temporary, not a fling he would tire of, but someone under his full protection, who had become integral to his life, and anyone who threatened me answered to him personally. The temperature in the room shifted, something settling as the men exchanged glances and then nodded their acceptance. And I understood with crystal certainty that I had just crossed a threshold, that there was no going back to the woman who delivered pizzas and dreamed of escape, because I had entered Vincent's world permanently and irrevocably. Weeks passed in a blur of integration and transformation as I found myself woven into the fabric of Vincent's life in ways that felt both natural and surreal. And he gave me real work managing the legitimate sides of his business empire, the security consulting firm, and the real estate holdings that operated in full daylight with proper contracts and legal structures. I proved myself capable quickly, my abandoned business degree finally finding purpose as I streamlined operations and identified expansion opportunities. And I watched the men who had assessed me with such weariness begin to nod when I spoke in meetings to ask my opinion on deals to treat me as more than just the boss's woman. Vincent and I grew closer with each passing day, the intensity between us deepening into something profound and unshakable. And he told me he loved me one night after a charity gala where I had worn emerald silk and stood beside him as he worked with politicians and businessmen who pretended not to know the source of his wealth. I said it back without hesitation because I meant it with every fiber of my being, and I saw the way his eyes softened with something like relief, as though he had feared I might not feel the same depth of emotion. But danger came, as it inevitably does in his world, swift and brutal, and targeting the weakness everyone could see. I was taken from a parking garage 3 blocks from Vincent's office building, grabbed from behind as I walked to my car, a cloth over my mouth that smelled chemical and wrong, and I woke in a warehouse with my head pounding and my wrists zip-tied to a metal chair. My captor stepped into view and my blood turned to ice because it was Marcus alive and smirking and clearly working with people who wanted to hurt Vincent through me. He said he had sold information about me to a rival organization, details about my routines and vulnerabilities, and they had paid him well, while also offering him the revenge he craved after Vincent had driven him from the city. Fear spiked through me sharp and familiar, the old terror of being at Marcus's mercy. But it was tangled now with fury because I had fought so hard to escape him and build something new. Marcus gloated about how Vincent would have to trade territory and concessions to get me back, how this would damage the Torino Empire, and I laughed bitterly, despite my split lip, because he had no idea what he had started. I told him Vincent did not negotiate with people who took what was his, that Marcus had just signed his own death warrant, and I watched uncertainty flicker across his face before rage replaced it. He hit me hard across the face, and I tasted blood again, that familiar copper tang, but I did not break or beg because I was not the same woman he had terrorized, and I knew with absolute certainty that Vincent was already coming for me. Gunfire erupted outside the warehouse in sharp staccato bursts that made Marcus's head snap toward the sound, his bravado crumbling into panic as he realized Vincent had not come to negotiate, but to wage war. And I watched Marcus's hand shake as he pulled a gun from his waistband and pressed the cold metal against my temple, his voice high and desperate as he screamed that he would kill me if anyone came closer. The warehouse door exploded inward with a boom that reverberated through my bones, and Vincent walked through the smoke and chaos like an avenging angel, alone with his hands visible and empty. But his face was death itself, all cold fury and lethal promise, and I had never seen anything more terrifying or more beautiful. Marcus's gun pressed harder against my skull as he shouted that Vincent needed to back off, or I would die, that he wanted guarantees of safe passage and money and a dozen impossible things. But Vincent's voice when he spoke was calm and certain as a blade, telling Marcus to let me go, and he could walk away, that this did not need to end in more bloodshed. Marcus laughed wildly and said he was not stupid enough to believe that lie, that Vincent would hunt him forever, and I felt the tremor in Marcus's body behind me, fear and desperation making him unpredictable and more dangerous. Vincent's eyes found mine across the space between us, and I saw the message there as clearly as if he had spoken it aloud, the slight tilt of his head and the focus of his gaze telling me to trust him, to be ready. And I understood with perfect clarity what needed to happen. I threw my weight backwards suddenly, the chair tilting on its back legs, and Marcus's gun jerked away from my head as he tried to compensate for the shift. And in that fraction of a second, Vincent moved with deadly precision, his hand producing a weapon I had not seen, and firing once with the cold efficiency of a man who had done this 100 times before. Marcus dropped like a puppet with cut strings, the gun clattering across concrete, and I hit the ground hard, still tied to the chair, pain radiating through my shoulder and hip. But I was alive, and Marcus was not. Vincent was beside me in an instant, his hands steady as he cut through the zip ties with a knife that appeared from somewhere, his fingers gentle as they touched my face and checked my injuries, cataloging the new bruises Marcus had added to my collection. And I was shaking so hard my teeth chattered. But I managed to tell him I was okay. Vincent held me while I cried, not the careful tears of someone trying to stay quiet and invisible, but the raw sobs of someone finally, completely safe. And when the crying stopped, he looked into my eyes and said that it was over, that Marcus could never hurt me again, that no one would ever hurt me again, not while he was alive to prevent it. And in that moment, in that warehouse smelling of gunpowder and justice, I knew that I had found something I had never dared to hope for. Not just safety, not just protection, but love that was fierce enough to kill for me and gentle enough to hold me while I healed. 6 months later, Vincent asked me to marry him in the garden behind the main house, where Mrs. Rosewood had planted roses that bloomed in impossible colors. He said he wanted to spend the rest of his life protecting me, loving me, building something beautiful with me. And I said yes because I had learned that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is trust someone completely, and sometimes that danger is exactly what saves you. Our wedding was small and private, just his closest associates and Mrs. Rosewood, who cried happy tears and said she had been waiting 15 years to see Vincent smile the way he smiled when he looked at me. And as we danced to music that played from hidden speakers, surrounded by the scent of impossible roses and the warmth of people who had become family, I marveled at the journey that had brought me here. From a broken woman delivering pizzas and hiding bruises to a wife and partner and forced to be reckoned with in my own right. I responded that I had found myself in his protection, discovered strength I had not known I possessed, and together we had built something real and lasting from the broken pieces we had both carried. Neither of us was perfect, and our life together would never be simple or safe. But we were perfect together in our imperfection, two damaged people who had recognized something essential in each other that first night, when a pizza delivery to the wrong address had changed both our lives forever, and the future stretched before us dangerous and uncertain, but utterly ours to claim and defend and shape into whatever we chose to make it. The first year of our marriage was a masterclass in navigating the delicate balance between love and survival in a world where both were luxuries most people could not afford. Vincent kept his promise about protection, but he could not shield me from the reality that loving him meant accepting a life where danger was as constant as breathing. I learned to read the subtle shifts in his posture that meant trouble was brewing, the way his jaw tightened when Tony brought reports of territorial disputes, the careful distance he maintained when he thought a situation might spill over into violence. And slowly, Carefully, I began to understand that my role in his world was not just as the protected wife tucked safely away, but as someone whose insight and intelligence could help him navigate the complex web of alliances and rivalries that defined his empire. The Torino Foundation became my domain completely, but it also became something more than either of us had originally envisioned. What started as a legitimate front for money laundering evolved into a genuine force for change in the neighborhoods Vincent controlled, and I discovered that I had a talent for building bridges between his criminal enterprises and the communities that depended on both his protection and his largesse. We opened 3 new health clinics in areas where people had been going without basic medical care for generations, established scholarship programs that sent dozens of kids to college every year, and created job training centers that gave people alternatives to the street corners where Vincent's soldiers recruited new talent. The work was deeply satisfying, but it also brought its own complications. Government officials who had been happy to look the other way when the Torino family kept their activities in the shadows began paying closer attention when our foundation started making national news for innovative community programs. FBI agents started showing up at charity galas, asking pointed questions about funding sources and oversight procedures. Vincent and I spent hours discussing how to protect our legitimate operations from scrutiny while maintaining the criminal enterprises that made them possible, walking a tightrope between transparency and secrecy that required constant vigilance. 6 months after our wedding, Vincent's uncle Antonio returned from a 10-year prison sentence with old grudges and new ambitions. Antonio had been Vincent's father's brother and partner, but he had also been the one whose recklessness and greed had led to the federal investigation that nearly destroyed the family business. Vincent had restructured everything after Antonio went away, building a more careful, more sustainable operation, but Antonio came home expecting to reclaim his former position and influence. The family meetings grew tense and frequent, with raised voices carrying through the walls of the main house as Vincent tried to balance respect for family hierarchy with protection of everything he had built. Antonio was charming when he wanted to be, the kind of old-school mobster who kissed women's hands and told stories that made everyone laugh, but I saw the calculation behind his smile when he looked at me. He viewed me as an outsider who had gained too much influence over Vincent too quickly, a weakness that could be exploited or a threat that needed to be eliminated. At family dinners, he would make comments about the changing nature of the business, how women belonged in certain roles and men in others, how traditions existed for good reasons and should not be abandoned lightly. Vincent would respond with diplomatic politeness, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand would find mine under the table and squeeze gently in reassurance. The situation came to a head when Antonio approached me directly, cornering me in the foundation office one afternoon when Vincent was across town meeting with port authorities about shipping schedules. Antonio told me he understood that I thought I was helping Vincent by modernizing his operations and involving myself in business decisions, but that I was actually making him appear weak to rivals who were looking for any sign that he was losing his edge. He suggested, with a smile that never reached his eyes, that it might be better for everyone if I focused on traditional wifely duties and left the family business to the men who understood how these things worked. I listened politely until he finished speaking, then stood up from my desk and looked him directly in the eye as I told him that Vincent's strength came from his intelligence and adaptability, not from following outdated rules about who could contribute what to the family enterprise. I said that the foundation was not just window dressing for his criminal activities, but a genuine extension of his vision for what their territory could become, and that anyone who wanted to drag the family backward into old patterns of violence and short-sighted thinking would find themselves fighting both Vincent and me. Antonio's smile disappeared completely, and for a moment I saw the man who had terrified people into submission for decades before his arrest, but I held his gaze steadily until he nodded once and left without another word. That evening I told Vincent about the conversation, expecting anger or concern, but instead he pulled me close and said he was proud of how I had handled his uncle, that standing up to Antonio had probably earned me more respect from the family soldiers than months of charity work could have accomplished. But he also warned me that Antonio was not the type of man who accepted defeat gracefully, that I should be extra careful about my routines and security protocols until the situation resolved itself one way or another. 2 weeks later, Antonio was found dead in his apartment, apparently the victim of a heart attack brought on by years of prison stress and poor diet. The medical examiner found no evidence of foul play, and the funeral was well attended by family members and business associates who spoke fondly of his contributions to the Torino legacy. Vincent delivered a moving eulogy about the complexity of family loyalty and the difficulty of adapting to a changing world. And if anyone suspected that Antonio's sudden death was more convenient than coincidental, they kept those suspicions to themselves. In the aftermath, I found myself thinking about the thin line between justice and revenge, about the moral compromises that came with loving someone whose solutions to problems often involved permanent endings. Vincent never confirmed or denied any involvement in his uncle's death, but I noticed that he seemed lighter in the weeks that followed, less burdened by the weight of family politics and more focused on building the future we had envisioned together. I chose not to ask questions I was not prepared to hear the answers to, and instead concentrated on expanding our foundation's reach into education and housing development. The second year brought new challenges as rival families began testing the boundaries of Torino territory, probing for weaknesses in Vincent's organization and looking for opportunities to claim pieces of his business empire. The De Luca family, who controlled shipping operations on the other side of the city, started moving into neighborhoods that had been Torino territory for 3 generations, offering better terms to local business owners in exchange for protection payments and political influence. Vincent responded with characteristic calculation, meeting force with force when necessary, but also using economic pressure and legal challenges to defend his interests without triggering an all-out war. I discovered that my background in business administration and my legitimate connections through the foundation gave me access to information that Vincent's traditional sources could not provide. City planning documents revealed which neighborhoods were slated for development projects that would dramatically increase property values, giving us advance warning about where the De Lucas might try to establish footholds. Banking contacts helped us identify shell companies and financial structures that revealed the true scope of rival operations, allowing Vincent to target their most vulnerable assets with surgical precision rather than broad retaliation. Our collaboration deepened as Vincent began including me in strategic planning sessions with his lieutenants, valuing my perspective on long-term consequences and relationship building. Tony Castellano, who had initially viewed me with skepticism, became one of my strongest allies as he saw how my insights helped prevent costly mistakes and identify profitable opportunities. David Sterling remained cautious but respectful, acknowledging that my presence in Vincent's inner circle had made him more effective rather than more vulnerable, as some had predicted. The De Luca conflict reached its peak when they made the mistake of targeting one of our health clinics, vandalizing the building and threatening the doctors who worked there as a way of demonstrating that even Vincent's legitimate operations were not safe from their reach. It was a miscalculation that revealed they fundamentally misunderstood what the foundation meant to our community and to Vincent personally. Within 48 hours, 3 De Luca stash houses had been raided by federal agents acting on anonymous tips. Their most profitable drug distribution network had been dismantled by coordinated police action, and their patriarch Giuseppe De Luca had been arrested for tax evasion based on financial records that mysteriously appeared in the hands of investigative journalists. The speed and efficiency of Vincent's response sent a clear message to other families about the consequences of targeting our civilian operations, but it also demonstrated a level of coordination with law enforcement that made some people nervous. Vincent's ability to mobilize legitimate authorities against his enemies suggested connections and influence that went far beyond traditional organized crime relationships, and I began to understand that his empire was more sophisticated and far-reaching than I had initially realized. He controlled not just territory and businesses, but information networks and political relationships that allowed him to wage war through bureaucracy as effectively as through violence. As the 3rd year of our marriage began, I found myself pregnant with our first child, a development that filled both of us with joy and terror in equal measure. Vincent had always been protective, but the prospect of becoming a father transformed him into someone who saw potential threats in every shadow and analyzed every decision through the lens of what would be safest for our growing family. He hired additional security, installed more sophisticated surveillance systems, and began talking seriously about stepping back from the most dangerous aspects of his business to focus on the legitimate enterprises that could provide for our child without the constant risk of violence. But pregnancy also made me more determined than ever to expand the foundation's work in family services and child protection, areas where I could see our money making an immediate difference in the lives of people who had no other advocates. We opened a domestic violence shelter that provided not just temporary housing, but job training and legal assistance to help women build independent lives. And we established a network of after-school programs designed to give children alternatives to the street life that had claimed so many young people in our neighborhoods. The work was personal now in ways it had never been before, as I imagined the kind of world I wanted our child to inherit and committed myself to building it one program at a time. Vincent supported my expanded vision for the foundation, but he also insisted on additional security measures that reflected his understanding of how children could be used as leverage against their parents in his world. Our house was transformed into a fortress with hidden safe rooms and emergency protocols, and Vincent began training me in weapons handling and defensive tactics, despite my initial reluctance to learn skills I hoped never to need. The contrast between planning nursery decorations and practicing with firearms was surreal, but it was also emblematic of the life we had chosen together, where love and danger existed in constant tension. The baby came in early spring, a daughter we named Isabella after Vincent's grandmother, who had been the only family member to show him unconditional love during his difficult childhood. Holding our daughter for the first time, seeing Vincent's face transform with wonder and fierce protectiveness as he cradled her tiny form, I felt the final pieces of my old life fall away completely. I was no longer the broken woman who had delivered pizza to the wrong address, no longer the victim who had needed rescuing, but someone who had built something lasting and beautiful from the wreckage of what came before. Mrs. Rosewood proved to be an invaluable ally in navigating new motherhood, sharing wisdom from raising her own children while respecting the unique challenges of protecting a child in our world. She helped establish routines that provided Isabella with normalcy and stability while accommodating the security requirements that Vincent considered non-negotiable, and she became Isabella's first and most devoted babysitter when foundation business required my attention. Parenthood changed Vincent in ways I had not anticipated, softening edges that I had not realized were still sharp and revealing depths of tenderness that he had kept hidden even from me. He would spend hours reading to Isabella, his deep voice gentle as he worked through picture books about farm animals and fairy tale princesses, and I often found them napping together in the nursery, Vincent's large hands protectively cradling our daughter's small form. But it also made him more ruthless in eliminating threats, more willing to use extreme measures against anyone who might pose a danger to our family, as if becoming a father had clarified his priorities in ways that made him both more human and more dangerous. The fourth year brought federal attention that we had been expecting but still hoping to avoid. A new prosecutor named Sarah Chun had been appointed to head an organized crime task force with a specific mandate to investigate the Torino family's operations, and she brought a level of sophistication and persistence that previous law enforcement efforts had lacked. Chun understood that modern organized crime families like ours operated primarily through legitimate businesses and political connections rather than traditional violence and intimidation, and she began building cases based on financial crimes and corruption charges that were much harder to defend against than simple assault or extortion allegations. Vincent and I spent months preparing for the scrutiny we knew was coming, working with lawyers and accountants to ensure that the Foundation's operations were completely transparent and legally bulletproof, while also creating additional barriers between our charitable work and Vincent's criminal enterprises. We knew that Chun would try to prove that the Foundation was simply a front for money laundering, so we documented every dollar of funding from legitimate sources and established audit procedures that exceeded legal requirements for nonprofit organizations. The investigation intensified when Chun obtained warrants to search our offices and seized financial records dating back 5 years, looking for evidence of coordination between the Foundation and Vincent's less legitimate businesses. For weeks we operated under the assumption that our phones were tapped and our meetings monitored, communicating in code, and meeting in public places when we needed to discuss sensitive topics. The stress was exhausting, but it also proved that the systems Vincent had built were robust enough to withstand intensive scrutiny, and that the legitimate aspects of our empire could function independently of the criminal enterprises that had originally funded them. Chen's investigation ultimately failed to produce the evidence needed for major prosecutions, but it succeeded in forcing Vincent to become even more careful about maintaining separation between his various business interests. We emerged from the federal attention stronger and more sophisticated, but also more aware of how quickly everything we had built could be threatened by a determined adversary with government resources. The experience reinforced Vincent's conviction that the future of our family lay in transitioning gradually toward completely legitimate operations, a process that would take years but would ultimately provide Isabella with inheritance options that did not require constantly looking over her shoulder. As Isabella grew from infant to toddler, I watched Vincent struggle with questions about what parts of his legacy he wanted to pass on to our daughter and what parts he wanted to leave buried in the past. He had inherited his position through violence and trauma, stepping into leadership as a teenager when his father was killed by rivals. But he wanted something different for Isabella. He began talking about establishing trust funds and educational foundations that would give her the resources to build whatever kind of life she chose, whether that included continuing the family business or striking out in entirely different directions. The foundation continued to grow and evolve, becoming something that neither of us had originally envisioned, but that felt like the most important work either of us had ever done. We were no longer just providing services to underserved communities, but actively working to create economic opportunities and social stability that would reduce the appeal of criminal organizations for future generations. It was slow work that required patience and long-term thinking, but it was also deeply satisfying to see neighborhoods transform from places where people felt trapped by circumstances into communities where families could build hopeful futures. By the time Isabella turned 3, Vincent had successfully transitioned most of his operations into legitimate businesses or partnerships with other families who were willing to handle the more dangerous aspects of territorial control. He maintained enough criminal connections to ensure our family's protection and continued influence, but the day-to-day management of illegal enterprises had largely shifted to other people, freeing him to focus on real estate development, legitimate security consulting, and expansion of our charitable foundation. The transformation was not without costs, as some of the men who had worked for Vincent for years found themselves marginalized or forced to find new positions with other organizations. But it also attracted new talent from people who wanted to build careers in legitimate businesses with strong community connections. Tony Castellano proved remarkably adaptable, transitioning from enforcer to head of security operations with a talent for managing complex logistics and personnel issues. David Sterling expanded his role into strategic planning and government relations, using his understanding of law enforcement procedures to help us navigate regulatory requirements and political relationships. Our marriage evolved alongside our business empire, deepening from the passionate intensity of our early relationship into something more sustainable and multifaceted. We were partners in every sense of the word, sharing responsibilities for Isabella's upbringing, the foundation's operations, and Vincent's continuing business interests with an ease that felt natural despite the unconventional circumstances that had brought us together. We had learned to read each other's moods and needs, to support each other through stress and celebrate successes together, to maintain romance and intimacy despite the demands of parenthood and empire building. The 5th anniversary of our first meeting, the night I had delivered pizza to the wrong address and changed both our lives forever, arrived with little fanfare but deep significance. Vincent surprised me with dinner at the same restaurant where we had first eaten together as a couple, though this time we were accompanied by Isabella and Mrs. Rosewood, our chosen family gathering to celebrate not just our past, but our future together. As we sat around the candlelit table, sharing stories and watching Isabella charm everyone with her 3-year-old wisdom and energy, I reflected on the journey that had brought us from that moment of desperate vulnerability to this place of strength and contentment. Vincent raised his wine glass in a toast to the woman who had changed his life by accepting his protection and then transformed it by becoming his partner. And I responded with gratitude for the man who had seen my worth when I could not see it myself, and then helped me build something beautiful from the broken pieces we had both carried. Neither of us was perfect, and our life together would never be simple or completely safe, but we were perfect together in our imperfection, two damaged people who had recognized something essential in each other that first night when a pizza delivery to the wrong address had changed both our lives forever. The future stretched before us, full of possibility and uncertainty, as it always had, but now we faced it together with the confidence that came from having survived every challenge that had tested us and emerged stronger each time. We had built something real and lasting from the broken pieces we had both carried, an empire that encompassed legitimate businesses and charitable foundations, a marriage that balanced love and partnership, and a family that would carry our legacy forward into whatever came next. Isabella fell asleep in her father's arms as we walked back to the car, her small hand clutching the rose that Mrs. Rosewood had given her from the restaurant's centerpiece, and I knew that whatever dangers and opportunities the future might hold, we would face them together as a family, united by love that was strong enough to transform even the darkest circumstances into something beautiful and meaningful and lasting. The woman who had once hidden bruises under long sleeves was gone forever, replaced by someone who had learned that true strength came not from avoiding danger, but from choosing wisely who deserved your trust, and then having the courage to build something extraordinary together, one day at a time, one choice at a time, one moment of fierce love at a time.